Hello, welcome back again. It's 10 o'clock now, so we're going to be talking probably 5 or 10 minutes, just a little bit about borders and how they're important and who makes them and where do they come from. And I'm sure lots of people will have conversations with people around the impacts of lines that have been drawn on the map, particularly after post-colonial times, imperial coverage of European white nations across the world, when lines on maps, particularly say North Africa, straight lines drawn between forts, French Foreign Legion forts, very simplistic, through to people deciding how they're going to partition countries, leading to the conflicts that are still impacting on the world now, like the border region, like Kashmir between India and Pakistan. Very complicated, very difficult to learn about if you are not from that area, because it comes with a lot of emotion, and it's particularly anything that's underpinned by nationalism, politics, religion, and particularly how politicians use a lot of that stuff to stoke discontent and disquiet amongst people. It's really interesting, and the more that you look at that, the more you realise just how manipulated that kind of behaviour is as well. So for part of the newsroom, the 24-hour newsroom, we've created 16 blog posts. In each of those blog posts, because we're the documentary media centre, they contain documentary media. So the idea behind that is, how do you create film, photography, audio and new media? New media might be social media or alternative media, or it might be how those social media channels are used in order for old stuff to be digitised and then presented online, whether that's old documents, whether that's old photographs, whether that's old footage, for people to be able to share. So it all comes under new media, really. And what we've got with the borders one, is starting with Dodge Belinda's film Frontera de Grandeza, which was filmed in Brazil, and we'll be talking to Dodge live at 1 o'clock our time, 6 p.m. his time, in Salt Lake City in the States, specifically about this film and the period of time that it took to create, over 2 years, and also what it's about, really. I mean, Brazil's probably got one of the longest, most porous borders in the world, let alone South America, and it borders so many different countries that these zones, are places in the middle of nowhere. They're very porous when it comes to the trafficking of all sorts of things, including people, and the crime that it associates with sort of border towns and border cities and stuff. And Brazil's approach in trying to do this, all pre the existing President Bolsonaro. So it's an interesting view from that point of view, to see how it functions and how it operates and the impact that it has on both sides of the border. So there's a trailer to the documentary there. And I definitely encourage you to sort of seek it out and watch it on view on demand. Okay. The next one is a documentary made by Ira Lee from the Cultures of Resistance film movement. And what's interesting about the current situation with the lockdown with COVID-19 is Cultures of Resistance have made all of their portfolios of films free to watch on YouTube. So this particular film is free to watch on YouTube, so I would definitely encourage you to do that. There's a link through to it there, and it's called Life is Waiting, about Western Sahara, and really gives some context to a conflict that I never really knew much about, the rise of the Polisario Front in 1973 when Spain withdrew. They thought they were going to get some involvement, the Sahrawi, in running their own country, and then basically Mauritania invaded from the north, and other people got involved and basically threw these people out. So a lot of them now live across the border in Algeria, in one of the world's largest refugee camps. And the Polisario Front became an armed struggle for many, many years. It's still not recognised by a lot of countries. The UN does its bit, but doesn't always do it well. There's a UN monitoring service there, but doesn't really kind of get involved in it. So it's really quite complicated, and it makes it quite interesting to find out about the struggle that people have against the rule that Morocco has, and the hold that it has over the kind of areas and stuff. One of the things I'll mention at the end as well is the border there is one of the longest sand berms that exists in the world, and a lot of that was built with US money through sort of private contractors. It's heavily mined, one of the biggest minefields in the world as well, and it's an ongoing situation there which really doesn't get spoken about at all. So I've given a link to the documentary there, and also a link to some social media that you can follow. A lot of the people involved in the Polisario movement sort of live in exile in Europe and can't live locally. The next one is a documentary on BBC iPlayer, and it's called One Day in Gaza, and it's the 14th of May in 2018, filmed on the day that the United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem and opened its embassy. So you've got this juncture position between people building up and arriving at the border to protest, as they regularly do, but this day had a specific or more of a relevance to them. And so you've got this footage being filmed in Jerusalem of the embassy being opened, and all of the fanfare, and at the same time sort of all the incidents of people being shot. Nearly 1,000 people, I think, were sort of shot and injured that day, many of them in the leg, sort of deliberately kind of wounded. Very complicated situation. You've got to know your stuff before you make any kind of comment about it, both sides of it. But yeah, it's quite an interesting documentary, and definitely worth a watch. The photography part here is from a guy called Simon Brain Thorpe, and this is from something that he did back in 2015 in the Sunday Times magazine, and he got these Polisario forces, the military forces, to act as toy soldiers and take up the position of plastic toy soldiers, actually standing on pieces of plastic as well. They were all dressed the same, various poses, and it really kind of brings into play that the thought that largely nomadic indigenous inhabitants of the Western Sahara region, the Saharis, and how their disarmed struggle for many years, and now they've stopped, and the peace process is ongoing. Talks keep getting promised and keep getting cancelled, but again, it's one of those things, if you think you find out about it, you're probably quite shocking actually. The audio element here is a podcast called Thinking Aloud, and of course I immediately typed aloud as in ALOUD, thinking aloud, and in fact it was actually not thinking aloud as in with permission. So it's quite interesting to play on words. It caught me out when I was putting the blog post together. And again, it's all very much around borders, and it's talking to the director of the Research Centre on Migration, Refugees and Belonging in the University of East London. Definitely worth a listen if you want to understand a little bit more and educate yourself around these situations. Yeah. The new media parts, two final things to think about really. The first one is called the Out of Eden Walk, which a lot of people won't know about, but basically Paul Salopek is an award-winning journalist, and in partnership with the National Geographic, he's doing a 21,000 mile walk on foot. Yeah, so slow journalism in its most extreme form. It takes him 10 years. I think he's about 6 or 7 years into it now, and he's walking from Africa, the birth of civilization, all through the Middle East, all the way round, across the top, down North America, South America, and he'll be finishing at the bottom after a decade. And what he does every mile, he has a milestone. And he stops, does a 360-degree film, takes a photograph, and interviews the nearest person, who they are, where they're going, what they're doing and stuff. And what's been interesting about looking, there's a link there to the whole project there where he writes, and there's a whole education element to it as well, where schools can get involved. Out of Eden Walk Learn, it's called. Amazing. So if you're a teacher, you can get your school involved in it. The biggest issue that he's had throughout the whole route so far over the 6 or 7 years has all been borders, police checkpoints, borders, and the issues between not people. He's met lots of people along the way, ordinary people going about their business. It's always anything that relates to politics and to the local police force. So again, definitely worth checking out. A fascinating project. There's a little explainer there as well for you about why Kashmir remains one of the most militarised regions in the world. Very complicated scenario, ongoing tension all the time. more than probably gets reported in international media, and certainly our media. Fascinating scenario there. And then the final one is something that I'd never really thought about before, and it was quite shocking to me when I did some research around it for the Newsroom. And it's this concept of the walled world. And really the best way to explain it is the West, or the developed world, or the global North. So I'm talking about places like Australia, New Zealand, America and Canada, and Western Europe, and the Scandinavian countries, are like a gated community. And this whole concept is explained very well in this article, but basically what it was saying is that the border, or the territory north of Australia, facing Indonesia, one of the most populous countries in the world, is heavily fortified or heavily guarded, militarized zone, if you like. The border between Mexico and North America is being made even more impenetrable by Donald Trump. And then, interestingly, in Africa, it's the border, this sand berm that's around Western Sahara, because of the amount of minerals and sand that comes out of Western Sahara, funnily enough, but also that's the main fishing ground off of their coast, the rights that Morocco have with the European Union. So in fact, the European Union on the one hand is trying to recognise people that are in exile, representing the Sahrawi, but at the same time it's their countries of the European Union that are doing the fishing, which is driving this whole scenario about. So what you find when you look at a lot of these conflicts that have existed and exist now around the world is it's less about war fighting, and politicians use religion and local discontent in order to come down. It all comes down to resources, the push for resources, the maintaining of resources. Africa's a perfect example of that. It seems to have gone out of the frying pan of empire into being independence, and maybe infighting and still being exploited through the Cold War with smaller proxy wars, into now the domination of external countries again, like India and particularly China with its Belt and Road. So a fascinating concept there. I'd never really thought of it from that point of view, and it really did change my view of the role that borders play. And of course, in this existing scenario we're in with the whole kind of COVID-19 coronavirus, a lot of us are starting to realise now that, in that walled community, we are probably one paycheck or two away from catastrophe, which from our point of view would be catastrophe. Whereas in fact, a lot of people that are in the global south, which then turns out are outside of that walled community, so the places that we deal with here with Parallel Lives, those 100 odd countries where we support through our community practice documentarians that are making film, photography, audio, new media about those global social issues, are in fact that day's wages away from starvation, because it's what you make that day. You're living hand to mouth literally on that day. So fascinating concept, borders. It's something that we look at and don't really take for granted, particularly if you've got a passport that allows you to move around in Europe. The novelty of going travelling again, I'm sure the novelty of air travel will take a while before it returns. I'm just going to reach over here because this is something I brought in to show Julian earlier. When I was preparing for this event, I came across this old atlas that I had from when I was a kid that really kind of got me involved, interested in the world. Sort of old black, sort of sepia coloured pictures, different places, lots of places with different names now. That's different from here. This would have been from the 70s, I should imagine, this atlas, where I fell in love with the world, still fell in love with the world, and want people to really think about the impact that they can make by a little bit of understanding in order to make the world a better place. Thank you very much.